They tried to shut her down in the first 5 minutes. A smirk. A loaded question. A quick dismissal. But what happened next flipped the entire hearing on its head. Because this wasn't just about the Epstein files. It was about sealed records. Missing months in a federal timeline. Communication logs no one wanted to discuss. And when Bondi held up a simple chart, just dates on paper, the room went silent. Not dramatic silence. Dangerous silence. By the end of this hearing, one question was echoing across the chamber. What happened during the months that don't exist on the record? And why didn't they want her to keep talking? Stay with me, because what unfolded next changes everything. They thought she would fold. They thought one sharp question would rattle her. They were wrong. The hearing room didn't look dramatic at first glance. Polished wood. Neutral walls. Flags standing quietly in the background. The kind of setting designed to look controlled, orderly, procedural. But underneath, tension, thick enough to feel. Cameras were already live. Red lights blinking. Every network monitoring the feed. Social media teams clipping in real time. Lawmakers shifted in their seats. Staffers whispered behind folders. Legal pads filled with half-written notes. Everyone knew this wasn't just another hearing. It was about the Epstein files. And that subject carries weight. Then it happened. A senior committee member. Experienced, confident, known for aggressive questioning, leaned forward. Slowly. Deliberately. He adjusted his glasses. Tilted his head slightly. And smirked. It wasn't subtle. It was the kind of smirk meant to signal control, superiority, and incoming takedown. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need. You're speculating, he said sharply. Pause. Do you even have evidence? The room tightened. There it was, the implication hanging heavy in the air. She didn't know what she was talking about. She was. Reaching. Grandstanding. Playing to the cameras. A subtle jab, but very public. The kind designed to chip away at credibility. Few lawmakers exchanged glances. Some nodded. Slightly. This was the moment. They assumed where the narrative would. Reset. Where she would retreat. Clarify. Backpedal. But Bondi didn't flinch. Not even slightly. No defensive body language. No visible irritation. Just stillness. Pause. She adjusted the microphone. Small movement, but intentional. The sound echoed lightly through the chamber. She looked straight ahead. Not at him. Ahead. Calm. Control. And when she spoke, it wasn't emotional. It was surgical. On March 14th, she began evenly. A deposition was recorded under seal in connection with witness testimony regarding flight activity between 2002 and 2005. The tone shifted. Immediately, she wasn't arguing. She was citing specifics. Dates. Document identifiers, case numbers. She referenced a motion filed in federal COURTA redacted exhibit, a set of flight logs that had been partially released and partially withheld. She didn't rush. Each sentence landed carefully. Measured. Double quotes those logs. She continued. Correspond with entries later referenced in internal communications obtained during civil proceedings. Internal communications. That phrase hit differently. You could see it. The smirk began to fade. Just slightly. Because now this wasn't speculation. This was structure. She moved to depositions. Name the month. Reference. The legal counsel present. Explained. Inconsistencies between early testimony and later revisions. Not dramatically. Clinically. The room grew quieter. Even the staffers stopped whispering because something was happening. The attempted dismissal wasn't working. Instead of shrinking under pressure, she was expanding, laying groundwork, building a framework that was difficult to interrupt without looking evasive. The lawmaker tried to regain footing. Are you suggesting wrongdoing? He interjected, but she didn't take the bait. I'm suggesting, she replied evenly, that there are discrepancies in the public. Record that warrant clarification. Clarification, not accusation. That word choice mattered. It reframed everything. Now, the burden shifted. If there was nothing to hide. Why resist clarification? You could feel it. That subtle shift in power. what was supposed to be a controlled takedown was slowly turning into something else. Something uncomfortable. Then, she did something no one expected. She mentioned a sealed record. Just 4 words. There is a sealed exhibit. That was it. But the air changed instantly. A sealed exhibit? In a case already surrounded by controversy. Heads lifted. Even those pretending not to pay attention were now very attentive. Chairman leaned slightly forward. Lawmaker who had challenged her narrowed his eyes. Because sealed records are different. They aren't rumor. They aren't commentary. They're documents the public hasn't seen. And the public not seeing something in a case like this raises questions. She didn't elaborate. Immediately. Paused. Let the silence do its work. Then she continued. That exhibit was referenced in testimony but never fully entered into open discussion. Double quotes reference. But not discussed. Why? She didn't speculate. She didn't accuse. She simply laid out the procedural gap, the difference between what was acknowledged and what was examined. You could almost hear the viewers at home leaning closer to their screens, because now the story wasn't about her credibility. It was about access. About transparency. About what had and hadn't been brought into public view. A staffer passed a note down the row. 2 lawmakers began whispering. One looked at his phone. The tension wasn't explosive. It was controlled. The kind that builds slowly and sticks. The committee member who had tried to corner her spoke again, this time less sharply. Are you authorized to discuss sealed materials? There was a defensive pivot. She didn't claim to reveal contents. She didn't overstep. She stayed precise. I'm authorized to reference procedural history. She replied. Again. Surgical. Not dramatic, but devastatingly controlled. And then she added something that deepened the intrigue. The exhibit relates to correspondence tied to witness coordination. Correspondence. Witness coordination. 2 phrases that carry weight in any legal context. But in this case, they carry gravity. The room didn't erupt. It froze. Because if correspondence existed regarding coordination, who authored it? Who received it? And why wasn't it fully addressed in open proceedings? The questions multiplied instantly. And she hadn't even revealed details. That was the brilliance of it. She didn't overstate. She didn't dramatize. She let the implications speak for themselves. Lawmaker leaned back slightly now. No more smirk. No more visible confidence. Just calculation. Because the optics had shifted. The cameras were still rolling, and now it looked like he had underestimated her. What was supposed to be a clean dismissal had turned into a moment of control, a pivot point. The audience, both in the chamber and watching remotely, could sense it. But then, she said something that truly changed the temperature. This sealed record, she continued, was cited in relation to timeline inconsistencies. Timeline inconsistencies. There. It was a new layer, because timelines and investigations matter. They establish sequence, cause, and effect. Responsibility. If the timeline didn't align, that wasn't minor. That was structural. The chairman cleared his throat. Subtle. But noticeable. Committee member who had initiated the challenge glanced toward him. And for the first time since the exchange began, there was hesitation. Bondi paused. Let the silence stretch. Not dramatically. Just long enough. Then she concluded this portion calmly. I believe the public deserves clarity on why that exhibit remains sealed despite its procedural relevance. Not outrage. Not accusation. Clarity. That word again. And in a hearing like this, clarity can be more disruptive than confrontation, because once the idea of missing clarity is introduced, it doesn't disappear. It lingers. The room felt different. Now. Less combative, more cautious. Because something had shifted beneath the surface. The attempted humiliation had failed. The narrative had flipped, but the real tension wasn't what she had said. It was what she hadn't. What exactly was in that sealed exhibit? What correspondence was she referencing? Who was involved in that coordination? And why, after all this time, had it not been openly addressed? That's when everyone realized This wasn't just an exchange. It was the beginning of something bigger. And what she revealed next would change the tone of the entire hearing. The word sealed echoed, not loudly, but heavily. You could almost hear. Pen stopped moving. The subtle scratch of note-taking faded. Staffers froze mid-sentence. Even the hum of side whispers seemed to dissolve into something tighter. Bondi leaned forward slightly. Not aggressively, deliberately. "There are files," she said carefully, choosing each word like it carried weight, "that haven't been fully examined in public." Pause. That phrase did something. It refrained the entire hearing. This wasn't about theory anymore. It wasn't about headlines. It was about access. Access denied. And that's when another lawmaker cut in quick, sharp. "Are you suggesting misconduct?" There was an attempt to box her in. Because if she said yes, it becomes accusation. If she said no, it weakens her implication. A trap. The tension spiked instantly. Several heads turned toward her. The camera zoomed slightly closer. You could almost feel producers in control rooms holding their breath. But she didn't back down. She didn't rush to answer. She didn't overcorrect. Instead, she shifted the frame. "I'm pointing to discrepancies," she replied evenly. "Discrepancies. Neutral. Precise. Dangerous. Then she listed them. Missing timestamps in digital. Evidence logs. Redacted witness names in documents that had already been partially disclosed. Subpoenas issued. But with no public record of compliance, she didn't raise her voice. Didn't dramatize. She stacked facts. One on top of another. Missing timestamps. Redactions without explanation. Unanswered. Subpoenas. Not accusations. Patterns. And patterns are harder to dismiss because patterns imply repetition. Consistency. Design. A few members shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. One lawmaker adjusted his tie twice in less than 10 seconds. Another leaned back and folded his arms, a defensive posture disguised as indifference. Others avoided eye contact entirely because everyone in that room knew something. The Epstein case was never just about one man. It was about networks. Power. Protection. Influence. And influence leaves fingerprints. Bondi continued, her tone steady. "When documentation gaps occur in isolation," she explained, "they may be clerical. But when they appear repeatedly within connected materials, that raises legitimate oversight questions." Oversight questions. Again, not misconduct. Oversight. That word forced the room to deal with process instead of emotion. And process is harder to argue against. One member attempted to interject, but stopped halfway through because the logic was clean. Structured. Difficult to dismantle without directly addressing the gaps themselves. Then came the moment that stunned the chamber. Bondi shifted to something more specific. Communication. Logs. Not emails she'd read. Not anonymous sources. Logs. Metadata. Reflects documented contact between individuals already identified in public filings. She said carefully. Metadata. That word alone changes conversations because metadata doesn't rely on interpretation. It records. Time. Date. Origin. Destination. And she made something very clear. These are not rumors, she added. These are logs. The distinction landed. Rumors can be dismissed. Logs cannot. Not easily. She didn't name the associates directly, but she referenced them as high-profile individuals previously acknowledged in related proceedings. That phrasing was deliberate. She stayed within what had already been publicly referenced. But she connected dots. Documented contact during key periods. Contact that overlapped with investigative milestones. The energy shifted. Again, this wasn't about theory. It was about timing. About who spoke to whom and when. Several members began flipping through their briefing binders more aggressively now. Searching. Confirming. Or maybe hoping the details weren't there. The lawmaker who had earlier challenged her leaned forward. Again, but the tone was different. Less confrontational. More cautious. "Are you implying coordination?" he asked. Another trap, but she sidestepped it. "I'm implying relevance," she replied. Relevance. Again. Precise. Controlled. She wasn't alleging conspiracy. She was demanding examination, and that subtle difference made it harder to silence her without looking defensive. The room felt smaller now. More compressed. As if the walls themselves were absorbing the weight of what was being said. Then she added another layer. The logs coincide with periods during which certain subpoenas appear to have stalled. Stalled. That word carried friction. Subpoenas don't stall on their own. They're followed up, tracked, enforced, unless something intervenes. The silence. Stretched, you could see calculation across faces, because if communication overlapped with investigative slowdowns, that wasn't speculation. That was sequence, and sequence tells stories. Bondi. Didn't press emotionally, she didn't accuse individuals. She simply laid out the timeline. Intersection, contact, delay, redation, repeat, pattern, Just as she prepared to elaborate, the chair interrupted. Time has expired. The phrase echoed differently than usual, because it didn't feel procedural, it felt strategic. Convenient timing, she had just begun to thread. Communication logs to investigative pauses. And suddenly, time. The gavel tapped lightly. Staffers shifted. Microphones clicked, and just like that, it was cut short. But something irreversible had already happened. The question was now. Public, not whispered behind closed doors, not buried in filings, public, who else was involved? And why? Were certain records still hidden? Because once you mention logs, people want to see them. Once you mention redactions, people want to know why. Once you mention stalled subpoenas, people want explanations. The room didn't erupt into chaos, it didn't need to. The disruption was quieter, more controlled, more unsettling. Bondi leaned back slightly. Not defeated, not frustrated, composed, because she knew something. The interruption may have stopped her sentence, but it amplified her point. Clips were already being marked. Producers were isolating the word logs. Social media would replay the phrase not rumors, logs within minutes. The hearing had shifted from confrontation to curiosity, and curiosity is harder to shut down. But then something unexpected happened. A voice from the far end of the dais cleared his throat. Not one of her usual allies, not someone known for aligning with her on high-profile matters. He had remained silent until now. Observing, listening, measuring. I'd like to hear the rest of her answer. The room turned. Several members exchanged glances, because this wasn't partisan support. This was procedural defense, transparency defense. And that changes dynamics. The chair hesitated, just slightly, enough for everyone to notice, because once another member publicly requests continuation, shutting it down looks deliberate, and deliberate looks political. The silence grew heavier. Would the chair allow it? Would the logs be discussed further? Or would the topic be redirected entirely? The cameras remained locked, the red light still blinking. And viewers across the country were leaning closer, because what was unfolding wasn't loud. It was methodical, controlled, and potentially explosive. The sealed files, the communication, logs, the stalled subpoenas, the redacted names. They weren't accusations. They were threads. And if someone allowed her to keep pulling, what would unravel? That's when the surprising voice spoke again, and the direction of the hearing shifted in a way no one anticipated. No one expected him to speak. He had been quiet the entire session. Reserved, arms folded loosely. Expression neutral. Occasionally jotting something down, but never signaling where he stood. Watching. That was his role. Watching. And in a hearing like this, the quiet ones are often the most calculating. Then suddenly, I'd like her to continue. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. But they cut clean through the room. Every head turned. Staffers stopped mid-typing. One camera operator instinctively adjusted focus. Even the chair blinked twice before responding. Because the voice didn't belong to one of her usual defenders. It belonged to a senior. MEMBER, a seasoned operator. Not exactly known for agreeing with Bondi. Not someone who rushed to back controversial lines of questioning, which made it different, which made it matter. He leaned forward slightly. Transparency is not optional, he said evenly. Public trust depends on clarity. Transparency, public trust, accountability. Words that carry weight in a hearing like this. Words that shift gravity. Suddenly, this wasn't partisan. It wasn't ideological. It was procedural. And procedural arguments are harder to dismiss without looking defensive. You could feel it. The narrative had tilted. Earlier attempt to corner her now looked premature dot and the interruption that cut her off. Now it looked cautious. Bondi didn't rush to capitalize. That would have been obvious instead. She waited dot just long enough. Then she nodded once. Respectfully. Thank you, she said dot measured dot control dot she. Understood something critical in that moment. This wasn't a victory dot, it was an opening. Openings in hearings like this are fragile. You don't storm through them dot, you step carefully. She clarified her position immediately. This isn't about politics, she began. She made direct eye contact with the room. It's about process. Process dot again. That word, neutral, structured, hard to argue against. About why victims' testimonies were handled inconsistently. That landed quietly dot victims dot that. Shifts moral weight instantly dot, because when you frame it around victims, resistance becomes riskier. She continued. Why? Certain depositions were delayed beyond standard procedural windows. Specific dot not. Dramatic. Procedural windows dot technical. Language that signals credibility. And why some subpoenas appeared selectively enforced. She let that word hang dot selectively. Dot not ignore dot not. Dismissed selectively, which implies decision dot choice dot discretion dot. The room tightened again because selective enforcement raises uncomfortable questions dot, not about mistakes dot, about intent. A member 2 seats down adjusted his microphone but didn't speak dot. Another leaned toward his aide and whispered something. Quickly Bondi noticed, but she didn't react. She kept the focus steady dot. Pause dot. Then came the boldest moment. Yet she leaned slightly closer to the microphone and asked publicly, who decides what the public is allowed to see? Silence. Not polite silence. Not routine. Silence dot, heavy silence. The kind that feels like pressure in the ears, because that question didn't just challenge individuals dot, it challenged the system dot. Who decides? Is it investigators? Prosecutors? Administrative reviewers? Political appointees? Judges? And on what basis? Security? Privacy? Reputation? Influence? No one answered immediately, because answering it requires naming authority dot, and naming authority invites scrutiny. That's when body language started telling its own story. A rushed note passed down the table dot. 2 lawmakers leaned toward each other, whispering urgently. One staffer stepped quietly toward the back of the room. Phone already in hand dot. The chair shuffled papers unnecessarily. A subtle tell dot, something was happening behind the scenes. You could see it unfolding in real time. Dot not chaos dot, coordination dot. Bondi held steady. She didn't repeat the question. She didn't escalate. She let it breathe, because the power wasn't impressing. It was in letting it linger unanswered. The senior member who had defended her earlier nodded once. Almost imperceptibly, he understood what had just happened. The conversation had shifted from content to control. And control is sensitive, because if the public starts questioning who decides what remains sealed, that pressure doesn't disappear when the hearing ends. It follows. Then she added another layer. Victims were told certain materials would be reviewed comprehensively, she said calmly. Yet public records suggest review processes were narrowed. Narrowed dot again. A subtle word with sharp edges. Not abandoned. Not erase dot, narrowed dot, which implies reduction dot, limitation dot, scope control. A different member tried to regain control of the tone. Are you alleging obstruction? He asked. There it was again dot, an attempt to force her into a legal accusation, but she didn't step into it. I'm alleging inconsistency, she replied dot, consistency dot, process dot, transparency dot. She kept returning to neutral pillars, and that made her harder to attack dot, because anyone pushing back too aggressively would now appear to be resisting. Clarity dot. The room had changed temperature. Earlier it was combative dot, now it was cautious dot, measured dot. Even those who disagree with her seemed careful about how they responded, because the public framing had shifted. This wasn't about defending a position dot, it was about explaining a gap. And explaining gaps requires detail dot, then dash, just as momentum was building. Another interruption. A procedural motion, raised. Abruptly, point of order. The phrase cut through the tension like a blade. A request to redirect. To limit scope. To bring the discussion back to relevant subject matter. Relevant. As if transparency and investigative procedure wasn't relevant. The chair nodded. Slowly, the motion was acknowledged. Discussion began about staying within defined parameters. Parameters. That word echoed uncomfortably, because who defines parameters? And how narrow can they be drawn? Bondi sat back slightly. Not surprised. Not rattled. But attentive. She knew something the room was now beginning to understand. If the discussion required procedural redirection, it meant it was touching something sensitive. Senior member who had spoken earlier glanced toward the chair again, not confrontational, but watchful, because procedural redirection can look like management, or it can look like avoidance, and viewers can tell the difference. The cameras were still rolling. Clips were being cut in real time. The phrase, "Who decides what the public is allowed to see?" was already trending in political circles. Online, the hearing had crossed into dangerous territory. Not because of what had been proven, but because of what had been questioned. And questions can be more destabilizing than answers. Bondi adjusted her papers slowly. Calmly. As if she had expected resistance. As if this next point had always been coming, because what she was about to reference wasn't abstract. It wasn't about redactions alone. It wasn't about logs and isolation. It was about sequence. Timing. And something that didn't alig in a timeline. And timelines are powerful because they don't rely on interpretation. They rely on order. Event. Response. Delay. Action. When that order breaks down, it tells a story. She glanced down at a printed chart in front of her. A simple visual. Columns. Dates. Markers. She hadn't introduced it yet, but she was about to. And if the procedural motion hadn't intervened, she would have already walked through it, which raised a new question in the room. Why interrupt now? Why narrow scope at this exact moment? Because what she was about to show didn't just highlight inconsistencies. It suggested something more structural. Something harder to explain away as clerical error. Senior member spoke quietly to the chair again. Debate over parameters continued. The momentum had already shifted. The audience could feel it. The room could feel it. Something didn't add up, and Bondi was about to explain exactly why. Because the timeline she was preparing to reference contained a gap no one had publicly addressed, and once that gap was visible, it wouldn't be easy to ignore. By now, the energy was different, less combative, more cautious. Bondi's final remarks weren't loud, they were deliberate. "This isn't about headlines," she said. "It's about whether justice was fully pursued." Pause. Then she asked it. The question that cut through everything. Were all investigative avenues exhausted or selectively closed? No one answered directly. Instead, there were general statements, commitments to review, promises of ongoing evaluation, but no direct response. And that silence? That might have been the loudest moment of the entire hearing, because hearings end, clips trend, headlines move on, but records remain, and so does doubt. The Epstein case has always been surrounded by shadows. This hearing didn't remove them. It highlighted them. And now the public is asking, what's in the files we haven't seen? Who decided what stays hidden? And what happens next? Because if this hearing proved anything, it's that the story isn't over. Not even close. For Bondi brought out a printed chart. No dramatic flourish. No theatrics. Just paper. White. Clean. Structured. But sometimes the quietest props are the most dangerous. She placed it flat on the desk in front of her, adjusted it once, then slid copies toward the clerk for distribution. The room leaned in because visuals change hearings. Claims can be debated. Charts can be examined. And this one was simple. 3 columns. Dates of known investigations. Dates of reported incidents. Dates of internal reviews. Nothing flashy. Just chronology. But chronology tells stories. She didn't begin with accusation. She began with orientation. Column 1 reflects publicly acknowledged investigative milestones. she said evenly. No reaction yet. Column 2 reflects reported incidents and witness statements entered into the record. A few nods. Still procedural. Then she tapped the third column lightly, and column 3 reflects documented internal review activity. Pause. Now she drew her finger slowly down the page, stopping. Midway. And that's when everyone saw it. A gap, not a week, not 2. Months. A stretch of time where activity should have been recorded. But WAS in single quotes T. No logged internal reviews. No documented procedural updates. No filing activity consistent with an active investigation. Just silence on paper. And silence on paper can be louder than words. She didn't raise her voice, didn't dramatize. She simply looked up. Can you explain this? That was it. 4 words, not dramatic. Precise. Which made it more powerful because she wasn't accusing. She was requesting explanation. An official cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses. It appears to be an administrative delay, he said. Administrative delay. A safe phrase. Non-threatening. Suggests paperwork, backlog, clerical issues, staffing shortages. It sounds harmless, but Bondi didn't nod. She didn't accept it. She leaned slightly forward. Administrative delays, she said calmly, do not typically eliminate system metadata. That word again. Metada. The room tightened, because metadata doesn't forget. It timestamps entries. Records, edits. Tracks access. Even when documents are moved, renamed, or archived. She continued. Electronic filing systems generate audit trails automatically. Audit trails. Now she was speaking in technical language, the kind that requires either confirmation or contradiction. And during this window, she added, tapping the gap again, there is no corresponding audit activity consistent with routine review. That hit differently because it wasn't about missing paperwork. It was about missing digital footprints. And in modern investigative systems, footprints are hard to erase accidentally. You could feel the discomfort, not outrage. Discomfort. The kind that creeps in when explanations don't fully land. A staffer flipped through documents more urgently now. Another leaned toward a laptop screen, scrolling. The official who had offered the administrative delay. Explanation shifted in his seat. Because now the question wasn't clerical. It was structural. Bondi, pressed gently. Were files accessed during this period? A pause. I would need to verify, the official replied. That answer didn't calm the room. It deepened it, because verification implies uncertainty, and uncertainty in a high-profile investigation raises eyebrows. She continued. If files were accessed, audit logs would reflect that. She let that sit. If files were not accessed, she added carefully, that suggests an activity during a period when investigative follow-up would have been expected. Expected. That word matters, because expectation is based on standard procedure. And standard procedure is measurable. One member attempted to intervene. Are you alleging intentional suppression? Yeah, sharply. Again. The attempt to force escalation, but she didn't take it. I'm asking whether documented activity aligns with procedural obligation, she replied. Procedural obligation. She stayed disciplined, never jumping the motive, staying anchored in process. But then, she introduced something new, a layer the room hadn't anticipated. There are references, she said carefully, to internal correspondence during this window. Correspondence. The word hung there. Emails. Messages. Communication. She didn't specify. Content. She didn't identify senders. But she made one thing clear. Those communications suggest awareness of ongoing review considerations. Awareness. Ongoing review considerations, which means discussion, which means engagement, which means activity. And yet, no audit trail reflecting that engagement. That contradiction was the real pressure point. If discussions were happening, why didn't system logs reflect procedural movement? Was the discussion informal, off record, preliminary, or something else? The room felt smaller now. Compressed, the senior member who had supported her earlier leaned back slowly, studying the chart more closely, because timelines are difficult to argue with. They either align or they don't. Bondi stopped short. She didn't name names, didn't cite specific email senders. She left it just ambiguous enough, which raised a new question. Was she holding something back, or was she waiting? Waiting for confirmation, waiting for denial, waiting for someone else to step into the gap? Because sometimes silence invites admission. The official at the center of the exchange wiped his brow lightly, subtle, but noticeable, without reviewing internal communications directly. He began cautiously. It would be speculative to characterize that period. Speculative, the same word used against her earlier. And now it sounded weaker, because she wasn't speculating. She was comparing columns. Then she said something that shifted the atmosphere entirely. If internal discussions occurred while formal investigative channels reflect no activity, she stated calmly, that raises questions about whether processes were followed or bypassed. Bypassed. There it was, not misconduct. Not conspiracy. Bypass. Which implies a decision. A deviation. A choice to step outside established channels. The room didn't erupt. Tightened. The kind of silence where everyone becomes hyper-aware of posture, breath, expression. Because procedural oversight is one thing. Bypass process? That edges towards something more serious, toward potential obstruction. She didn't accuse anyone of it. She didn't need to. She simply connected the logic, discussion without documentation, awareness without audit, timeline without trace. And then she asked a question that hung heavier than any accusation. Who authorized the handling of materials during this window? Silence. Longer this time, because authorization requires a name. And names change stakes. The chair shifted and his seat. Paper shuffled. Unnecessarily again, the official responded carefully. I cannot speak to authorization without reviewing internal records. Again, review. Again, delay. But the viewers at home weren't hearing nuance. They were hearing gaps, months of silence, possible internal emails. No clear authorization trail. The narrative had moved from procedural oversight to potential obstruction of process. And obstruction doesn't need dramatic language to feel serious. It just needs unanswered questions. Bondi glanced at the clock. Briefly. Time was thinning. She knew it. The room knew it. And so she made her final move in this exchange. Calm. Measured. Double quotes. If records exist clarifying this timeline, she said evenly, I request they be made available for public review. There it was again. Public review. Transparency. She brought it back to principle. Not blame. Principle. But the implication was unavoidable. If there is nothing to hide, why not release them? The chair cleared his throat. Time has expired. Again. The gavel tapped. Soft. But final. And just like that, the exchange ended. No definitive explanation. No confirmation of audit. Logs. No clarification of authorization. Just a chart. A gap and a question hanging in the air. The final exchange left the hearing suspended on one unresolved issue. If activity was discussed, but not documented, who made that decision? And why? Because in investigations like this, timelines don't just mark events. They reveal intent. And this one didn't add up. 5. Be sure to subscribe to the channel to follow more moving stories like this, and turn on notifications to stay up to date.